Welcome to this webinar. It's about the NATO summit and about Ukraine's fate in NATO terms. We, however, don't want it to sound too fatal, so we're going to try to put this topic in the context of Ukrainian and European public opinion, in the context of Ukrainian and European decision-making. Of course, we all know that, however, this summit is also, the summit is, you know, starting today, running through Thursday, and it's going to take place in Washington, D.C. It will, of course, be also overshadowed by the US election, so there is that as well. How is the possible change in American leadership impacting the topic of our discussion? On the agenda of the summit, we have a number of issues. There will be a number of bilateral security agreements. There is the issue of China. But most of all, the NATO summit is going to be about Ukraine's possible membership in NATO and how this fits in the context of Ukraine and Europe. For that, I have actually a great group of colleagues, Susi Dennison, Maryna Domushkina, and Rafael Loss. They're going to tackle the different aspects, and I will start with Susi Dennison, the director of our European Power Programme, who will talk us through the results of a survey that we did especially for the summit, both in Ukraine and in a number of European countries. Susi, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vessela. I'm just starting to put the data up now. Just bear with me a moment. Great. Hopefully you can all see now on screen a title screen for this poll. So yes, as Vessela said, I'm just going to talk very through the first part of this data set that we have, looking specifically at the question of how Ukrainian people are feeling about the ongoing war. This is the first time that we as ECFR have polled in Ukraine, although we've worked in the 15 EU member states that we covered in this survey a number of times. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about what we see there in terms of the differences between Ukrainian and European thinking. So I won't go into too much detail about the country coverage and the size, but broadly speaking, we covered nearly 20,000 people. All of the interviews were done online, except for in Ukraine, where we used phone interviews to have these conversations. So first of all, Ukraine's resilience and its political disconnection. What I think one of the key findings for us from the work in Ukraine in this poll was the strength of feeling among the Ukraine people, the people of Ukraine, that this war is still winnable. So as you can see, we got a majority of 58% saying that they believe that the most likely outcome of the war is Ukraine winning the war. And when we added in the question of an injection of increased support in terms of ammunition and military aid, that majority figure went up to 69%. But I think that what we can also see, as well as that, if we can call it resilience rather than optimism, we can see a real sense of realism. What I'm showing you now is the results of the question that we asked: when do you think the end of the war in Ukraine might happen? Within 1 year, within 1 to 5 years, or longer than that? As you can see, Ukraine is the furthest left on the chart in front of you. It's not wildly out of the European mainstream. So there is a sense that this is grounded in reality. The largest group believe that this could happen within the next year, but the next section of those who believe it will be 1 to 5 years is almost as big. In terms of what is stopping Ukraine reclaiming its territory and therefore getting to victory, Russia's military strength looms very large in terms of all of European thinking. As you can see, almost everywhere, the largest response were those who said that this is a large barrier, and if you add that in to the moderate sense, you get very strong majorities everywhere focused on this. But there is also a sort of general sense that this war is unlikely to lead to Russia attacking another European country anytime soon. As you can see here, that there are sort of mixed feelings in terms of different European countries on the probability of this, ranging from those like Portugal and Poland actually, who feel that this is potentially quite likely, through to those where you get a strong majority saying unlikely. But again, what I want to indicate here is that Ukraine is very much within the middle ground in terms of its perceptions of the way the conflict is likely to evolve. Again, because we're talking here about the NATO summit, the idea of NATO entering into war with Russia as a result of this is generally perceived to be an unlikely scenario across all of the countries that we covered. And that sense is even stronger. I would say, Ukraine is at the strongest end in terms of this picture on that point. In terms of what the Ukrainian people are sort of asking for, in terms of what they perceive as being absolutely necessary for the successful defense of Ukraine, as you can see, it's very much focused on sending more weapons and ammunition. Ukraine's accession into NATO is the second biggest response, but that comes a long way behind the importance of weapons and ammunition at this point. And there is also an ongoing positive view, actually, of the role that the European Union is playing in terms of the support which is being given to Ukraine. As you can see here, Ukraine gives the highest response in terms of a rather or very positive view that the European Union is playing in Ukraine. And it's very clear that in terms of perceptions of the other actors involved in this conflict from the Ukrainian perspective, it's second only to the US in terms of the support that it's bringing. I should note here, you'll see the very strong return on the negative role for China, which is something that we may want to talk about in the context of the NATO summit too. I should stress that this data comes from before the peace conference in Switzerland, which China was not involved with, and so this perception was already there in that sense. Just sort of coming to the end of this section, there is a concern there about the possibility of a change in US government and the possibility of what's referred to broadly as the sort of the Trump peace deal. So we asked the question of whether people were concerned that the US will negotiate for a peace deal with Russia without involving the Ukrainian government. What you can see here is that more people disagree that they should be concerned about this strongly, but it's fairly evenly balanced in terms of the risk that this is perceived to present, and so it's present in the mindset. But in terms of guaranteeing the long-term security, there is fairly clear thinking, I think, from the results from Ukraine on this front. We asked the question of whether, looking at the long term, so this question isn't just about ending the current conflict. This is about the long-term future of Ukraine. And as you can see that when we asked whether entering NATO or entering the EU is more important, both being equally important was by far the largest answer, the pink section on this chart. But then in terms of how that translates into their thinking about the conflict, we asked the question about if your government was offered a deal of entering NATO tomorrow in exchange for agreeing not to reclaim occupied territory, would you support it? As you can see here, in the context of the current conflict, that trade-off is not perceived as being worth doing. The answer was definitely not, probably not, giving you a very big majority there. But there is nuance here. So when we asked sort of which of the following outcomes would be more acceptable, this question was about losing parts of currently occupied territory, but remaining sovereign, i.e. being able to make geopolitical choices about entry into the EU and NATO, or gaining all the occupied territory, but not having those geopolitical choices. As you can see, the stronger answer, the purple section, is that control over geopolitical destiny and the ability to choose alliances. I think I might stop there for the purposes of the first section of the conversation, and hand over to others to tell us what this all means.
Thank you very much, Susi, and we can come back to the European context. Maryna Domushkina is our visiting fellow. She's Ukrainian, and we want to ask her, I mean, this whole trade-off question is a very complex one, and it's very difficult even for policymakers to grasp it. So I would put this caveat that we have asked publics to answer that question, and the clarity of their answer is quite surprising to me. Was it surprising to you? And what do you think the trade-off could look like? I mean, obviously, the sovereignist choice is the one that wins among all of the ones that we have asked Ukrainians. How do you interpret that?
Thank you, Vessela. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here. I think that the president of Ukraine stated almost a year ago that Ukraine is not trading off its territories in exchange for depart for any alliances or be part of any union. And it is very important to remember that. The question, like the whole discussion that appeared almost a year ago before Vilnius Summit was sparkled by the debate of the chief of staff of current NATO Secretary General. And when he said that these discussions are going on and policymakers and the alliance members are looking how to end the war, which of course infuriated Ukrainian public and Ukrainian government. Almost a year later, after delayed American assistance, after not fulfilled promises from the European Unions on the delivery of artillery shells, we see the perception of Ukrainian people. I think that territorial integrity and, of course, sovereignty are undivided concepts as it is stated in the UN Charter. With that, you know, what is the sovereignty? Sovereignty is the power to choose, who you go in to be in alliance with, what decisions to make, etc. And of course, if we even start the discussion about trading off, as you said, part of Ukrainian territories, it's very easy, you know, to be this theoretical policymaker, discusser, analyst, when it's not you who live in occupation. What does it mean for people of Ukraine? For how long will they stay under occupation? What legal status will be there? Are they remaining part of Ukraine? If even this trade-off happens, how we are going to ensure that at some point we will return these territories? These are the key questions, because it's not only about territories, it's also about the people who live on those territories, who live under occupation, some of them 2.5 years, some of them already 10 years, if we speak about Eastern Ukraine. So I think that the harsh realities of the front line are very much aligned with what we've seen in the polls, that people of Ukraine are not delusional, let's put this way, and they know that they can rely on themselves. But also, if you remember the first poll, when it was stated that 58% of Ukrainians still believe that we can win the war. And the next column was 69% believe that we can win if we receive all the promised assistance. And that's the key point. If the partners would deliver of what was promised, I think that in a timely manner, because time matters in this war, then this question will not even be on the table, whether we should or should not consider trading off territories. So for me, it was not a surprising poll, because I also see that my countrymen and countrywomen also think that sovereignty, like to preserve the sovereignty, it is the key. However, sovereignty and territorial integrity, and I would like to stress it again, is not divided, and it is stated in the UN Charter. And then we as an international community should decide whether we are still applying international law and there is rule-based order or not. I'll be brief here.
Of course, yeah. Thank you very much, and I think this is a good explanation, and also the fact that Ukrainians really still have this high morale. I think this is a very important point to emphasize on. It is not exactly the opinion of the rest of Europe. Many in Europe think that the odds have changed, and that the chances of Ukraine losing or at least not scoring the victory that it was hoping for have become higher. And so my question to Rafael is, we have seen the results for Germany, and Germans have understood that the war is there, that it's very important. They're, however, more pessimistic than Ukrainians about the outcome of the war. But starting from the kind of positive message, the fact that Germans understand the importance of the war is something that Chancellor Scholz basically talked about in his Zeitenwende speech. Has this changed sufficiently German policies towards the war? Especially given that you finally got the budget right last week.
We do have agreement among the coalition partners on a budget for 2025. So far, it does not include a truly significant defense spending increase. Government representatives will tell you that, of course, there is the 100 billion euro special fund that is continuing until roughly 2028 to add financial resources to equipment expenditures for the German armed forces. But there's the regular defense budget that is projected to essentially flatline, save for some inflation adjustments for the next couple of years until then. My sense is that this current government, for various reasons, is unable to resolve this deadlock, and that all political actors have effectively decided to leave this issue for the next government. I'm not sure whether the next government coming in after the September 2025 elections will be in a position to resolve this deadlock, though. The political preferences are fairly diverse, and they're difficult to bridge. So it would require quite some wrangling to get us over that hurdle. But let me zoom out from Germany a bit and look at NATO defense spending overall. And I think the Secretary General, outgoing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, recently released new figures showing that 23 out of 32 now allies are expected to meet or even exceed NATO's 2% floor target of defense spending. of GDP, and even a higher sort of figure, or rather 31% of that goes into equipment expenditure. The baseline here is 20%. So a significant chunk of money is going into boosting European NATO armed forces. This is critically necessary because of almost 30 years of underinvestment and particularism among European nations, where some had hoped at various points in time that the EU could add some value as a result of the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, or the lessons from the Libya intervention in 2011, when Europeans twice had to fall back on US leadership and ammunitions to conduct military operations. Europeans, I think, hope that in the future that might not be quite as necessary, because they do see Donald Trump's shadow looming on the horizon, and certainly he'll loom over the Washington summit that is kicking off today.
Yes, indeed. And Susi showed the slide on the outcome of the war again. Thank you for that. I think it's important to understand that those differences in perceptions also produce different expectations from policymakers. Maybe I can come back to Susi with a question. What are the points where you would think Ukrainians and Europeans agree, though, because they are not only divergences, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that what's quite interesting is that although there is this difference of perception over the most likely outcome of the war in Ukraine, we still get a very strong sense from the EU member states that we covered that they think that supporting that Ukraine and indeed potentially increasing the level of support in the event of a US withdrawal of support is the right thing to do. I think as the majority of countries, you get the strongest answer with that response. So there is this sort of divergence between expectation of the direction of travel and the role which we feel we should be playing as Europeans, which is broadly in line with the Ukrainian view. I think what Ivan Krastev and Mark Leonard highlight in their report is that the divergence then comes again with regards to why we should carry out that support, that there's an increasing perception among many European states. There are sort of different camps. There are those such as Poland, Sweden, Estonia, where you have a very strong sense that that we are supporting Ukraine in order to regain territories, to sort of win the war under the current the only definition of victory that there is. But then there's a sort of a growing sense among certain member states that the purpose of the military support is to put Ukraine in a stronger position to negotiate with Russia as and when that moment comes. Now, one could argue that that's sort of two different sides of the same thing, that a stronger military position within the war is precisely what does strengthen the negotiating position. On the other hand, I think there's also a sort of a symbolic value in the ongoing support of Ukraine and other Western actors, which also adds to that picture. So I think this is sort of one of the key differences which emerges around that perception of what Europe should do.
Rafael, we did discuss the German budget and the German defense spending, but you also mentioned the 2% threshold, if we can put it this way, for the allies spending. What do you expect will happen at the NATO summit vis-a-vis Ukraine, given that this is probably the most kind of talked about, negotiated by diplomats agenda point?
would completely agree with you that Ukraine certainly is the most hotly debated agenda point. There's a couple of others, of course, that are equally important from NATO's perspective, including its own defense transformation that has been ongoing since 2014 as a result of Russia's original first invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. But you're right to point out that how Ukraine is being discussed, how Ukraine's future relationship with NATO is being reflected in the summit communique are issues of intense debate. I think it's quite clear that the summit will not result in a more concrete membership perspective. There's some effort amongst allies, most certainly by the US administration, to avoid a repeat of the Vilnius experience, where you had an open falling out over the specific formulations. Today, various formulations have made their way into the public realm. There's talk about a bridge formulation. There's talk about an irreversible path formulation. It's a bit sort of rhetorical acrobatics to try to find new formulations for what is clear since the Bucharest summit that Ukraine's future is in NATO. Their attempts to sort of consolidate and express it more firmly, but they reach a natural end, and at some point will become absurd when we arrive at the 20th reformulation of the same political agreement over Ukraine's future being in NATO. But on the practical side, there are some measures that NATO will be taking at the summit, including consolidating some of the support efforts under the NATO umbrella. These are things that US leadership have previously provided, including logistical training coordination out of a US Army base in Germany. NATO is expected to take over these. There's also a pledge from NATO allies to roughly maintain the level of military support that they have provided to Ukraine on average over the past 2.5 years, which is a good sign. But it will certainly be a matter that will continue to be debated amongst NATO allies, because as Susi pointed out, some see Ukraine differently than others. Some see Ukraine's future relationship with both NATO and the EU differently than others. Especially the Nordic Baltic countries as the polling has shown, but surprisingly also countries like Spain and Portugal, who are pretty in favor of Ukraine joining both EU and NATO, at least compared to Germans or French or Italians. That is a bit of a surprise to me, but I think a trend that past ECFR studies has shown as well.
Thank you very much. So, Maryna, if we're talking about bridge and a sort of a diplomatic formulation that would help respond to the Ukrainian expectations for kind of a stronger formulation in terms of its NATO perspective. How do you think can the problem be avoided that we had at the last summit, where President Zelensky basically tweeted furiously on the way to the summit, and then it seems there seemed to be quite a lot of tension there around Ukrainians' NATO candidacy.
Thank you, Vessela. Well, I think we need, I'll start probably from the expectations and not go into comment on the tweets. I think that all of us humans could be sometimes more emotional or less emotional, but to give the reference, we all remember that in 2022, actually in Madrid summit, that summit was really a wartime summit, when the European Union, the NATO members actually felt that this is their war as well. And the situation has changed within a year in Vilnius summit. And of course, as Rafael pointed out, Vilnius summit is not much new rather than we had in Bucharest in 2008. However, what came out of that summit is, of course, G7 countries issued joint declaration pledging to work with Ukraine on long-term bilateral security commitments into bolstering its self-defense and deterrence capabilities. A year passed, we have Ukraine signed 20 bilateral security agreements together, including all G7 members. However, what strikes me when you look into those bilateral agreements, not all of the agreements link further military assistance with Ukraine's goal of liberating its entire territory. And that gets us back to the territorial trade-offs and territorial integrity. So I think it would be really good actually to define what phrases as, Ukraine's bolstering its self-defense and deterrence capabilities actually mean. Of course, in the agreements, countries committed to, at minimum, to maintaining the type of scale of military support and assistance that they've been providing since 2022. But again, getting us to my previous opening input, pledging is not delivering. To pledge is something different, and I always like to point it out. Again, with the 1 million shells that European Union promised to Ukraine by March 2024, we haven't received it. Now, in June 2024, Breton, the high official of the European Union, actually stated that the total capacity of manufacture production would be 1.7 million shells per year, when in reality, EU is not even providing the third of it. The recent reports of the Ministry of Defense of Estonia, the same with journalistic investigation, says that all total Western capabilities of manufacturing production estimated around 600,000 shells per year, and it is a third of 1.7 million. So to pledge and to deliver what you promise is actually something that should be finally put into force, because of course Ukraine, to give us a little and to expect us to fight with this little, and to actually, as Susi mentioned, to secure the strong negotiation position, well, it's a little bit, to put it mildly, unfair. So for me, what would be the expectations from the summit? I think it would be outlining more detailed goals of the military aid to Ukraine based on some unified vision of common set of measurable standards and what it will mean. Then, of course, hopefully to actually have some unified document where all commitments will be stated, because the definitions differ and they vary in those agreements. The commitments also differ in those agreements. And if, of course, Ukraine is, I think, not hoping for the invitation this year, unlikely last year, but formalization, the agreements into a coherent framework would be something that actually, help a lot. Strengthening the legal basis of these agreements, because we know that it is also very important for Ukraine and for further projections. And I would really like to see the linkage between military assistance and territorial integrity. Because if we all remember the declaration, it was about bolstering the assistance and deterrence from further attacks of Russian Federation. And deterrence from further attacks of Russian Federation can mean a lot. So it needs to be expanded, whether, again, the whole territory of Ukraine, what type of capabilities Ukraine should have, what type of assistance, because to maintain at the minimum, as we have from 2022, is not enough anymore. Is not enough when we see that Russian Federation is actually coupling with North Korea, with Iran. There are speculation about Chinese assistance, which was still a speculation. However, the dual usage of some production is been there for years. So I think expectations are at least to formalize what we have, to define what it would mean, the deterrence and military capabilities, what type of assistance, hopefully projecting cost estimates of the support for the entire 10-year duration of the agreements, because we know that there's been a lot of speculation, particularly in the US, when the assistance was delayed, that how much will it cost to them and how much more do they need to deliver. Of course, there is several agreements contain a benchmark of support that resembles the US support to Israel, and it's maintain Israel's qualitative military edge in bilateral agreement for the between US and Ukraine. This agreement doesn't contain the similar wording, which actually means that it could be decided and it could be changed. This qualitative support could be changed. And we are in the war of attrition. Unfortunately, Europe is still not perceiving this war as their war. And we've seen it from the poll. It is still Ukraine's war, which is rightly pointed is Ukraine's war, but wrongfully disregarded that if Ukraine falls, then the NATO is in war. So I think expectations from regular Ukrainian people are not high, unfortunately, because everything that was pledged was not delivered in the full capacity that could have been, and that could have changed already the course of war. Yesterday was the deadly attack in Ukraine. There were around 40 missiles shelled into the whole country, including the biggest children's hospital in Europe, including the private maternity ward. There is 37 killed people, around 170 injured, including 4 children, 100 civilian objects of infrastructure being destroyed or had a severe destruction. That talks about that if we were given what we were at least promised, it would already, protect much more civilian lives in Ukraine.
Clear. Thank you. There is already a question in the chat. It's directed to Susi. I would encourage the other participants in this webinar to maybe do this, ask the questions in the chat as well. Susi, if you would like to take this one about basically the definition of victory. What does it mean to regain all Ukraine's territory, or to have simply Ukraine in a better negotiating position? There are clearly these 2 camps in Europe, and what is that we can do to explain what Maryna just did? The fact that it's actually about protecting the civilian infrastructure and the civilian population of Ukraine, but also protecting our own security. So maybe if you can take this one. And I would also add the Orban question here, because this deadly attack on the children cancer hospital came basically hours after Orban left Moscow. So if this is effective peacemaking diplomacy, I don't know how it would look otherwise. Susi, over to you.
Thanks very much, Vessela. And I think for me, the two things are linked in terms of the Orban diplomacy and sort of what that represents in terms of division in Europe and the inadequacy of the European position at the moment in terms of achieving either of the goals that we talked about. Because I think, and maybe it's helpful for me to show again a little bit more data at this point. I think that what European policymakers are struggling with is precisely the dilemma that Maryna highlighted, that Europeans don't see they're not currently making the link between the fate of Ukraine in this war and European security. The strength of feeling about supporting Ukraine comes still from a sense of solidarity rather than our own security. So if we look here, what I'm showing you now is the data for a question on allowing Ukraine to join the EU now. And as you can see here, you have a fairly solid group of at least half the countries where the biggest answer thinks this is a good idea. And this is broadly the group of countries that we talk about as the sort of the hawkish countries in our data sets in terms of supporting Ukraine. But you can also see that when it's about EU membership, Spain enters this group as well, although it's not normally part of that group when you're talking about military aid and so on. But looking sort of behind this question in terms of why supporting Ukraine to enter the EU is a good idea, you can see the sort of the root of the problem, which is that essentially the two biggest answers that come through from the different EU member states are firstly that Ukraine is culturally part of Europe. This is its natural home, and secondly that it would end the war in the Ukraine. It would end the war in Ukraine. But when in terms of the answers who see this as Ukraine membership would make the EU more secure, i.e. they're making that link between this war and their own security, you can see this is the fifth line down, and you get very small responses from EU member states perceiving it in this way. Even I think it's important to highlight that the response about strengthening the EU's global position is relatively small compared to those two answers. So Europeans are simply not understanding the point that, and I think this relates back as well to the slide that I showed earlier on about the fact that there is a major risk in this context of NATO becoming involved in the context. This is just sort of perceived as something which is happening to a country very close to us, but not something that is happening to us. And so I think that is why we're getting the sort of the mixed messaging, the lack of follow through in terms of the European policy approach, that at the top level, they can see that voters feel that this is the right thing to do. But in terms of the prioritization of resources, and I think I would also say the prioritization of policymaker effort, if you like, in terms of delivering on those promises, it's not the number one thing. The number one thing, as we know from the European Parliament elections that we've just been through in many countries, is about the current economic situation. So sort of prioritizing and highlighting resources for this conflict is seen as important, but but not number one from a European public perspective. And the strength of feeling, coming back to Orban, about that varies in different capitals. It tends to be in the countries geographically closer to Russia, where there is more of an understanding that this is not just something that we should do, this is something we have to do. But when it comes to sort of European collective action as a whole, unfortunately, the divisions play against us, and nowhere more significantly than in terms of Orban taking his own line.
Thank you, Susi. Rafael, we have here a question on PESCO from Lawrence Howard. Maybe if you want to take that one. And in general, if you want to maybe delve a little bit into the whole issue of European defense / European pillar of NATO. My colleagues have posted in the chat a link to Camille Grand's recent paper on how to defend Europe with less America. So basically the question is, can Europeans do better in the mid to long term, especially against the background of what Maryna told us, that in the short term, we're not doing great?
I think, starting maybe from a bit of a philosophical point, democratic elections are what sort of characterize liberal societies. But in 2024, I think elections in the European Union and France and UK and looking across the Atlantic at the United States are sort of slowing down decision-making, because it means that policymakers always have to wait for the results of another election to come in before taking another round of big decision. That is understandable from the perspective of democratic legitimacy, particularly looking at sort of the budgetary responsibilities of many parliaments in Europe that are constitutionally enshrined. But it means that democracies are this year, unfortunately, slower to respond to an evolving battlefield situation in Ukraine. Maryna pointed out what this has led to. I think the EU's own toolkit to respond to the war has evolved significantly, both since 2014 with the EU's global strategy and now with the strategic compass that has come out just after the full-scale invasion. The EU has taken measures to utilize the European Peace Facility in innovative ways. It's found its niche in defense industrial policy to strengthen the European pillar in NATO, but there's divergences in how European capitals view this EU toolkit. Even though the Commission is eager to boost its competencies in this regard, there is some member states that are more hesitant, especially because it might mean for them to contribute a greater share to the EU budget in one way or another, and especially a common debt is still a big no-no for a number of member states, even in this realm of joint defense procurement and spending. For PESCO, that has meant that it remains one of the few key elements of the EU's security and defense policy toolkit, but it is also still underutilized, and I'm not sure that in this current moment it will grow further in ambition. There's some very positive examples, including in the realm of military mobility, where the EU again sees an added value that it can bring to the table for its regulatory, for its financial firepower. But in other areas, PESCO has been a disappointment, to say the least. So the picture here is ambiguous. It's a bit more positive in some of the other areas, including the European Peace Facility. We'll have to see what the next commission and potentially a defense industry commissioner will make of this, and how they identify ways to further strengthen this toolkit. But ultimately, it's going to remain a negotiation between where member states place their resources, political attention, and level of effort between NATO and the EU, and that in turn requires NATO and the EU to work more closely together. And I think there's also the summit will show that presumably a continued effort to strengthen coordination, cooperation, communication, which at times is a difficulty because of classification requirements, for example. One institution not being able to talk to the other about classified issues and things. There are a lot of hurdles that need to be moved out of the way to make this a robust European pillar within NATO. But it is certainly possible and urgently necessary given the moment that we're living in.
The moment that we're discussing this is also 2 days after the French elections. And we have been watching these elections very closely also because France has been the leader of the discussion about enhancing European security and defense. Susi, do you think this the result of this election is going to impact in any significant way the discussion about European defense and about the European leg of NATO?
Well, I think that, the immediate impact is obviously that Macron is going late to the NATO summit, but he's going. I think he's due to be there from Wednesday onwards. And I think that is, as with so many elements of this relatively surprising outcome of the French elections, a much better position than we anticipated being in with regards to France's international role. A lot will depend on the government that emerges from this election result. As we all know, the talks are ongoing between the left coalition within in Paris at the moment as to whether they can come up with a common proposal for a prime minister. And within that coalition, there is quite a broad church with regards to France's international role. So it ranges from La France Insoumise with quite a strong degree of skepticism about the transatlantic relationship and so on. And they will have the most seats in terms of the leftist coalition within government. So they'll be expected to play a strong role. But on the question of Ukraine, I think that here there is a sort of a broad sense of common purpose for the moment around the parties that we're expecting to come out in government. And I think that the questions in a way will be longer term about France, the ability of the French government over the coming years to play a sort of shaping role in the European context, as Macron would naturally want to do as elements of the NFP, the leftist coalition, the Place Publique and Parti Socialiste, who have quite a strong European vision. But I don't anticipate sort of immediate changes on this front. What will be difficult, though, is that in all likelihood, whatever government emerges will lurch from day to day in terms of deal making domestically at home, both within, if this coalition talks do manage to sort of build an alliance, or indeed if they are working with other political forces in government. Either way, there will be a lot of conflict domestically. So I think just in terms of political attention and headspace to the international picture, we're going to see a reduced France at the moment, at least for the next year, and probably up until the next presidential elections in 2027.
Not a great timing to see reduced France. Maryna, the last question will be to you. I will maybe try to group Lesio Grisco and Frederica Fazio's questions about what next in terms of the war. Whether you think there will be more kind of action towards the Russian territory per se. What is the role of Crimea in this whole equation? And here I want to also point to the work of our colleague Gustav Gressel, who is also on this call, who has been following very closely what is happening on the front and has always had a very good analysis on that. So, Maryna.
Thank you, Vessela. I think there is also an unanswered question about Prime Minister Orban's visits, so I will group them all together then.
I'm just trying not to put too much.
I think that's fine. I think that many of us have seen the recent interview that Prime Minister Orban gave to the German media outlet, and we might have various views. It's been highly criticized by the European Union leaders. The only correct question that Viktor Orban said during that interview is that if you don't stop the war will be in European Union. So he has a different lenses, but the statement is correct. The Viktor Orban and his, as rightly pointed out, so-called peace missions is based on his mindset that the full-scale invasion is worse than it was since 2014 with the Minsk, with the occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine and annexation of Crimea and so-called Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. That's the mindset that he comes from, that now we are in the worst situation, that there is a full-scale invasion, rather it was 10 years ago when they were signed Minsk agreements. However, it is a false mindset and perception, because we need to get back before 2014 when Ukraine was united within its territorial borders from 1991. And that's answering the question to Federica Fazio that President of Ukraine stated that the victory for Ukraine is actually getting back all its internationally recognized borders from 1991, persecution of war criminals, and accountability for war crimes, reparation, restoration, etc. However, this should answer your question that the territories we are referring to is the borders of 1991. Of course, the concepts of reintegration, those territories, when it comes to place, will be a different question, and I think it will be a different solution. Crimea, answering your question, Vessela, Crimea has a symbolic meaning for Russia. We all remember starting from 2014, the whole slogans from Russians, Crimea is ours. And I think that this fundamental ideological defeat in the Black Sea currently, because Ukraine managed to push Russian Navy from the Black Sea, it actually shows how painful it would be ideologically for Russia to lose Crimea. But as I said, despite of how many years it will take to get back Crimea and the parts of eastern Ukraine that were occupied from 2014, it still remains Ukraine and Ukrainian territory. Going to Les's question on restriction, I don't know. I wish and you have the same question as Ukrainian as you are. What will happen? Maybe our colleagues from European Union can a little bit talk more on that. But also mentioning these missions of Orban, I think I will end with a quote, a recent quote from Stoltenberg, when he said, whatever happens, I'm sorry, whatever happens now, if we talk about any ceasefire or negotiation at this current point in the war, it is pause, but not peace. So we need to remember that.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very good way to finish this conversation. I want to thank Susi Dennison, Rafael Loss, and Maryna Domushkina for being part of this, and I thank you all for listening and for asking questions. We have recorded this conversation, and we will be inviting you to our seminars again. Thanks a lot for participating.